If you've worked a job, almost any job, chances are there were moments, maybe they were hours, maybe they were years, where you felt just like a cog in a machine, just grinding away, completely replaceable, and making somebody else that you've probably never met before incredibly wealthy. We've kind of all had this experience mostly. And Murray Bookchin is here to tell you why. Welcome to Champagne Anarchism. And welcome back to this reading series where we are covering Murray Bookchin's The Ecology of Freedom. This is chapters 9 and 10. That's two images of technologies and the social matrix of technology. And that means that we're talking all about work today. No, it's actually technologies, but also work. It's a lot of stuff packed into these two chapters. This is a really, really ambitious project. It always has been from the start, where we read through this entire book. And if you've made it through these chapters, you've made it through what I consider to be some of the most interesting and most exciting material that there is in this book. The earlier chapters are great, but these two chapters and the two that are following, which we'll get to, I'll talk a little bit about at the end just to prep you for what's coming. These two chapters are fantastic. I mean, they are just brilliant. They suffer from a lot of the anthropological issues that we talked about before, but they are nonetheless really, really fascinating, and I think kind of incredibly important to talk about, especially modern day. I know I say this a lot, but this is actually true for this one. Now, we're going to break this chapter down into a couple sections, and they're going to cross-cut between the two chapters because they speak really well to each other. And a lot of things in these two chapters are actually going to come up again in chapter 11, but again, we'll get to that when we get to that. So let's talk through these two chapters. Now, first section is going to be on technology and technics. This word that Bookchin uses a lot, technics, is really, really important. So it's important to understand the difference, where this word comes from, why it's different from technology, why he's not talking about technology, but about technics. And we'll get into all of that. The second thing that we're going to talk about is work. And there's a lot to that. This is a section, it's mostly from chapter 9, where Bookchin takes direct aim at Marx's concept of labor. So we're going to talk through that just a little bit, and it's going to be really, really interesting. The third section, I've decided to break this out into what I'm calling animism. Now, this is a very specific point, but I think it fits a lot of what Bookchin is trying to get at in these two chapters. He's got a very, very specific argument that he's trying to push through here, and it has to do with organic societies and the way that they viewed things like labor. Then we are going to talk about liberatory technology. Now, liberatory technology refers specifically to an essay that Bookchin wrote back in 1965, long before this book comes out, but he actually refers to it directly in a footnote. He draws a lot from that essay, and it's kind of considered a foundational essay. So we'll get into liberatory technology. We'll talk about authoritarian versus libertarian technics. We'll talk about the rise of capitalism and the factory. We'll talk about all of that when we get to this section. And then finally, I want to end on a very short section where we go through some of the modern technology, the kind of future technology, the things that Bookchin only saw the early days of, things like social media, or didn't live to see, things like the rise of AI. Can we contextualize what's happening in the modern world based on what Bookchin was talking about back then, back in 1982 when he wrote this book? I think we can, although I will leave it as a bit of an open question. So let's get into it. Before we get into it properly, please don't forget, like, subscribe, comment, share with your friends, all of that good stuff. All of that really helps. Consider subscribing to the Patreon. That really, really helps keep this project going. If you subscribe to that Patreon, that's patreon.com/Champagne Anarchism. You can also get access to some videos about cool leftist movies. You can also see the 100 Great Anarchists series that's up. The first two are up. That's where we talk about Lao Tzu and Zhuangzi, the great Chinese Taoist philosophers that may have been sort of proto-anarchists. So all of that is up on that Patreon channel. Go please check that out if you have time. Without further ado, let's get into this. And I'm getting occasionally just blinded by light over here, so that's what that is. If I sort of come in and out of focus. That's what's going on behind me. It's kind of nice. I'm not gonna complain too much. Let's start though with technology and technics. Now, Bookchin uses technics rather than just technology to emphasize the fact that there is a clear interrelationship between tools and techniques and the social context that those tools and techniques are used in. In other words, there's a nexus between all of these different things that creates what we in modern day would call products. That term comes from the Greek techna. I don't think I'm saying that right. I did look it up before I recorded this video, but listen, if you're a classicist, please don't come after me, or do, and then I'll learn how to pronounce it. But techna, which is referring to something more akin to art, craft, skill, that sort of thing. This is an ancient Greek word that Bookchin is drawing on, and he's also echoing a very famous social theorist called Lewis Mumford, who he refers to directly in this book. He's kind of a major influence on Bookchin's thinking here, and Mumford also uses the term technics to describe this kind of fusion between tools and social organization. So that is what we're talking about when we talk about technology in Murray Bookchin's thinking. Now, technics are not just neutral tools. We have an understanding, I think now, of technology as something that is just sort of neutral, out there and available. You can just pick it up, you can use it. That's not what technics are. Bookchin is very careful to say that technics includes things like politics. Politics is also a type of technology or technics. It's the way that things get done, and that's really what he's concerned with. He's concerned with the fact that these tools are embedded in societies, and they're shaped by things like hierarchy and values and relationships between people. There's a complex web behind all of this. So when he talks about technics, he's not just talking about technology. He is, but he's also talking about the social context and the politics that goes behind this. So that is Bookchin's distinction. Technology, sort of the hardware, the material hardware out there, the machines, the systems, the tools, the implements, all of that. And technics is much broader, the ethical, the ecological, the kind of political dimensions of how tools are used. It's all contextualized. And that's very, very important to what we're going to get to. Now, another thing that Bookchin throws at us pretty early on in chapter 9 is straight from Aristotle, and it has to do with the difference between living only and living well, right? The notion of flourishing, sort of eudaimonia. You may have heard this before if you read a little bit around Aristotle or Nicomachean ethics. Nicomachean ethics? I think it's Nicomachean ethics because it's Nicomachus, isn't it? I don't know. Either way, there's a difference between living and living well, or living only and living well. And Bookchin uses this distinction to say something very, very important about our modern understanding of technology. If we just use technology to make our lives simpler, to make our lives easier, to give us more access to more things, that's not actually making us live better. That's making us live more easily. That's really all that's doing. Living well would be something that increases our happiness, our self-actualization, our understanding of ourselves, our flourishing out in the world, our artistic temperament, whatever it is. Living well is different from our material, physical needs. And in our modern society and understanding, we often confuse and conflate those two things. Now, there is one more thing about technology that we should talk about before we get into kind of the bulk of this argument, the meat and potatoes of what Bookchin is talking about in these two chapters. And that is that Bookchin is taking very specific aim here in these two chapters at people who argue about the distinction between sort of hard and soft technologies. And you may have heard a lot about this, especially people who get on TV and want to talk about the transition to a green economy, stuff like that. This is actually a very, very prescient thing. And we talk a lot about this. Hard and soft technologies, and Bookchin's understanding, and I completely agree with this, it's the difference between a very damaging technology and a technology that we hold up as doing a lot of good. So a coal mine is a hard technology, whereas a wind farm is a soft technology. These are sort of the things that underpin what we understand when we think about a transition, right? We think about, well, if we could just transition to better technology, we could save the world. And Bookchin says, no. This is not just about the technology. This is about the two together, society and technology. This is about society and technology working in a way that maintain an ecological balance. And you can do that with soft technologies, absolutely, but you have to address the society element first. Bookchin has this quote where he says, a small, soft, intermediate, convivial, or appropriate technical design will no more transform an authoritarian society into an ecological one than will a reduction in the realm of necessity of the working week enhance or enlarge the realm of freedom. So, in other words, and we will get to this argument later, but two societies may have the exact same technology, just with very, very different outcomes. An authoritarian one and a libertarian one, and we will get to that difference later on when we talk about liberatory technology. But first of all, let's talk about work. Now, in these two chapters, especially chapter 9, Bookchin is taking specific direct aim at Karl Marx, our favorite economist. And he says that Karl Marx has a very narrow view of labor, which is really interesting because Karl Marx is considered one of the great labor economists of all time and gives us a lot of really, really important things about the exploitation of labor that we take into modern economics. It underpins a lot of stuff. But Bookchin has a very specific gripe with this. Marx, when he thinks about human labor, he thinks about labor as a process that essentially animates dead objects, right? You take materials and you take a human, and the human takes those materials and makes them into something new. It's a process of giving life to something that was previously inert. And that is not a terribly ecological perspective, but it's also one that Bookchin hates because what Marx is doing in this recounting of work or labor is abstracting human labor. What that means is that you're making work a countable thing, a discrete thing. You can count labor. It is something that exists independent of anything else. And Bookchin thinks that's kind of ridiculous. And by the way, this idea of labor as being sort of abstract and something that is countable underpins a lot of Marx's economics, if not all of Marxist economics. It's something that gives us his idea of the labor theory of value, which is very famous. You may have heard of this idea. We can value a good or a product based on the labor hours it took to make that product. And Bookchin says, no, you're falling into a trap here. What you are doing is you are taking the humanity out of labor. A bunch of clouds just rolled in. Anyway, Bookchin says that yes, there was a point through the history of thought where we started to think about human labor as more discrete, kind of abstract, objectified. We stopped thinking about laborers as individuals and labor as this process, a harmonious process with the thing that was being shaped and the person shaping that thing. And we started to think of it more in terms of this is just a unit of labor. This is just a worker. We normally attach this idea to the process of mechanization or industrialization. Bookchin says it's actually wrong, but let's follow this line for a second. When we talk about the industrialization of the world, the mechanization of the world, you can see why these new technologies that are emerging, the factory, the assembly line, all of this stuff turns people from craftsmen to units of labor, right? It doesn't matter who's on that assembly line putting the stuff together. It doesn't matter. You could fire somebody and swap them out the next day and there would be no change in anything. It's pure mechanization. And so we think of this as an effect of technology, right? A new technology arrives and all of a sudden you can dehumanize people. You can make them only into units of labor. But Bookchin says, hang on, this is the trap that I'm talking about. It's not just the technology. The technology helps, but really, this is a process of subordination. This is subordinating the worker to the needs of the elite, the bourgeoisie. Mechanization is part of this story, but really, it's not a technology story. It's a hierarchy story. And that's why Marx, by using this language of abstraction and telling this story in abstract terms, is falling into this trap. Bookchin says, by its very plasticity, abstract labor renders human activity interchangeable, the rotation of industrial tasks possible, and the use of machinery flexible. That's the entire point. This is mechanizing to subordinate the workers, not the workers become subordinated because of a mechanization process. Anyway, let's talk briefly about animism. And animism is very important when we try to understand what Bookchin he calls organic societies, what they thought about labor. What they thought about labor is not very much. Bookchin says, and listen, I think this is not immune to the criticisms that we have leveled against Bookchin before. This is some shaky anthropological ground. But what Bookchin says is that early organic societies existed in a world where they were very, very harmonized with the things that they were creating. There was a synchronicity between the subject and the object. These things kind of worked together, right? You respected the thing that was being created and the thing, the raw material that you were creating it from. And it comes down to this idea of animism. Animism is the idea that there is some kind of spirit out there in all natural things and objects and the stones and the bears, everything, that there is a spirit that kind of animates nature, that there are tons of little gods out there and they must be respected. It's a very old view that's based on ritual, and it elevated the natural world. So what Bookchin says is that things like labor time and the products of labor would have been nonsensical terms to people in an organic society, right? This is all based on synchronicity, and only later on did it become the tyranny of subject over object. Previously, there was a harmonization between those two, and now there is tyranny of one over the other. And this is part of the process that Bookchin has been describing through this entire book of just subjugating the natural world to the needs of human civilization. This is the story, by the way, that Marx tells. This is his Promethean version of this, is humanity coming in and animating the dead natural world. That's what Bookchin is really taking aim at when he takes aim at Marx. So animism, it's old, right? It's based in these organic societies, and we don't consider ourselves to be terribly animistic anymore. Obviously, there are people who do believe that, and that's cool. But mostly, we tend to think of the natural world in terms that we can describe in very, very scientific terms. We know a lot more about the world around us now than we did back then when we were Neolithic humans wandering around in these pre-literate societies, right? But Bookchin then makes a very, very cool and very interesting argument for what you might call kind of a new animism, and I absolutely love it. And it's an argument that is not terribly complicated, because what it is essentially is an argument for humility. And I love it so much because this is an argument that I make a lot myself, just out in life. I think we must have some degree of humility. So we are now more advanced humans than we were back then in terms of our scientific understanding of the world. We know that there are no little gods out there, but Bookchin says, do we? And this is the argument for humility. There's this brilliant quote here. He says, unless human mentality validates its claim to superiority by acquiring a better sense of meaning than it has today, like it or not, we are little more than crickets in a field chirping to one another. And I love this idea. I love this idea because what he's saying here is, we don't know. Like, we actually do not know. The things that we do not know about the natural world, it is literally infinite. We know that there is a logic and a cohesion to the natural world that we have maybe messed with way too much. We know that there are things out there that we fundamentally do not understand. Bookchin isn't making an argument that there are little gods out there in nature that must be respected, but he is making an argument for human humility when we say that there definitively are not little gods out there in nature animating things, and that maybe we should respect nature a little bit more in terms of human civilization and appreciate the synchronicity of the thing that we are shaping. He's got this thing where he talks about ivory, the thing that we are shaping and the shaper of the thing. There is a harmony between those two that deserves respect, even if perhaps there aren't little gods out there inhabiting the ivory. Anyway, this is something that I love. This is something that I think about kind of a lot. This is kind of the main point of the Kazuo Ishiguro book, Clara and the Sun, which everybody should read. I love this idea, and it does come with the weight of expectation for valuing our craft, the things that we create in the world, and not just looking at these as raw materials to be shaped by some technological progress. We are sort of in harmony with the things that we create. Anyway, let's talk about liberatory technology. Now, liberatory technology, he's drawing very heavily on this 1965 essay, which is towards a liberatory technology. You can find that in his essay collection, Post-Scarcity Anarchism, which a lot of people in the comments have referenced, and it is an absolutely brilliant book that everybody should go read. It's a collection of essays. Some of them are truly foundational, and this one, I'll see, I can definitely link it on the Patreon. I can link it on the Patreon and probably on YouTube. It's out there on the Anarchist Library. Go check it out. It's worth a read. So we'll get back to this essay in just a sec. Let's talk about something else first, though, because Bookchin says that previously in these earlier societies, the organic societies, Neolithic, pre-literate societies, technics were brought into existing social institutions very slowly and very cautiously. So you got a new technic that's arrived, a new technology, anything from pottery, weaving, the wheel, all of this stuff. It's viewed with a lot of suspicion and a lot of how will this fit into the world that we live in now, the societies that we inhabit now. How will it help us? How will it change our society, right? There's a very cautious implementation of any new techniques because ultimately you don't want to upset the existing balance. And again, Bookchin is primarily occupied with this idea of balance. And he says that organic societies, and again, maybe some shaky anthropology, but the idea is very, very powerful. Organic societies, when they adopted new techniques, they would do so at a very measured pace. That's important. Why is that so important? Well, because technology or techniques has to fit in with the needs and desires of the community. And if it doesn't, then it shouldn't exist. New tools and new methods, new techniques need to be elaborated from within the community for the community, not imposed from anywhere outside or just wholesale adopted the way he says Europe would just go and adopt new technologies without really thinking about it. That's a broad oversimplification, but is a really interesting way to look at it. Technologies and techniques have to exist for the community that they are going to be used by. That might sound obvious. It's not all that obvious to us now. And we'll talk about the types of technology that we exist with right now in our present moment. I'm recording this in 2025. I don't know why I checked the calendar to do that, but you know, I'm recording this in 2025 and we'll talk about some of the technology that we use now, but Bookchin says that this natural suspicion and history of humanity resisting new technologies, it could only be broken by one thing, right? This is an ancient source of resistance, and it is only broken by the advent of capitalism. Now, modern capitalism, it intensified the labor process, and it went through this process of abstracting work and objectifying work. And you had the development of new forms of hierarchy, and Bookchin goes through some of those, right? You have nation states popping up. You have big faceless bureaucracies set up to manage the flow of power. New and kind of extraordinary concentrations of power are just arriving, and along with this, you have the rise of modern capitalism and especially the rise of the factory. And he has this really neat inversion here where he says that capitalism turns people into administered products, and it turns products, the products that are being made, into these kind of autonomous things that seem a lot like people. It's a really interesting inversion of people and product. It's really, really fantastic the way that he does this. Now, we should talk very quickly about one of the main distinctions that Bookchin makes in here, which is between authoritarian and libertarian techniques. Now, remember, politics is just part of technics. This is the context that everything exists in. It's part of this equation that makes up technics. Bookchin asks us to look at the differences between the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee, as we'd call them now, and the Inca. And he says the Haudenosaunee were broadly egalitarian, pretty libertarian, close to a type of communism, and the Inca were incredibly dominating and authoritarian. And that's pretty reductivist, I would say, but an interesting way to frame it. And he says that both societies had access to the same technology. They were using the same tools, but the techniques were radically different. For the Haudenosaunee, or the Iroquois, the techniques were libertarian, and for the Inca, they were authoritarian. And he uses this to make the extra point here that it doesn't really matter the technology or the tools that are being used, it's the context in which the tools exist. So the way that we build technology into society and the effect that that technology has, it depends entirely on the type of society that we're talking about. And this is where that 1965 essay comes in. Now, in that essay, Bookchin says that there is clearly a place for technology in anarchism. Technology, I mean, what does it do? It helps us. It can increase our leisure time. It makes our lives easier. It can foster ecological harmony if used right. It can help to support kind of self-sufficient communities. It can help prop up democracy, the direct democracy that Bookchin is such a fan of. He has this line where he says a liberatory technology presupposes liberatory institutions. You know, liberatory technology is the idea that technology is potentially very, very powerful. It just all comes down to this question of domination and hierarchy. Can we harness technology? We would need to change society. We would need to change the rules that society operates in and our relationship to each other. The domination of human by human. He's hit this point several times through this book already. But if we can do that, we shouldn't fear technology. There's no reason to fear technology. Technology just needs to be brought in, as these organic societies did, in a liberatory capacity to be used by the community, for the community, and elaborated within the community. And if we can do that, that's potentially revolutionary. Now, again, this is targeted at people who make the argument specifically that if we can change our technology, we can save the world. And Bookchin, again, is saying, no, it's actually not that simple. You need to change the hierarchical relationships between people in order to save the world, and then technology can become a tool for liberation rather than just a mechanism of our own domination. And that is very, very important, and that is the central argument of these two chapters and that earlier essay. And I recommend you go back and read that essay if you have time, because it is genuinely fascinating and fantastic. And this idea of post-scarcity anarchism, if you can read the full collection, totally worthwhile. But let's close out these two chapters by talking about what you might call future technology. Now, this is just going to be a mini reflection, right, on the modern nature of technology. Bookchin was around for social media, but he didn't live to see what it is currently becoming. He didn't see things like digital currencies or the rise of Bitcoin. He wrote this long before the advent of AI, or what we call AI, but it's actually just machine learning. Anyway, things like the gig economy apps, things like Uber and Deliveroo and Rappi, they didn't exist yet. So it's worth stepping back and thinking a little bit about the types of technology we have now versus the types of technology that Bookchin was talking about back when he wrote this book, or when it was published in 1982. And this is just a personal reflection for me. It just feels to me that increasingly technological innovation just exists to increase shareholder value, that there's very little else that it adds to humanity beyond just making crappy products that are going to be bought. very quickly and very cheaply, subordinating labor as much as possible. And it's worth asking the question, does this have any real application in our lives as the pace of this type of technology, especially things like the delivery apps and AI, accelerates? And I know that this is a trend that might feel different but isn't actually different. Or maybe I'm just getting old, but it's worth sitting with, right? In light of what Bookchin wrote back in 1982. He is talking about building liberatory technics and using the technology that makes our lives easier, building it into a socially supportive web, this social matrix, and we can invite it into the social matrix. Is that at all possible with our modern technology, with these sorts of things? That's an open question that I will leave to you. Let me know, as always, in the comments. You can reach out directly. I'm always happy to field those. I love hearing people kind of reflect on this stuff. So if you've made it through these 2 chapters, congratulations. This is genuinely kind of transformative stuff. And I think it can change the way that you look at the world and just give us a better idea of the kind of technological world that we're living in. So if you made it through, congratulations. We are going into probably the most complicated chapter in this book. That's chapter 11, which of course is called, is it the ambiguities of freedom? The ambiguities of freedom. I should have said that with more confidence. This is a very long chapter. It's very dense. It can be a little tough to get through. However, you can do it. And there'll be a video explanation of that coming up. So brace yourself a little bit for this chapter if you're reading along with this video series. Either way, I'll be back to break it all down. We'll be talking more about technology. We'll be seeing a little bit about how Bookchin would build kind of a positive idea for what his libertarian municipalism looks like. These last 2 chapters are some of the most interesting in the book. All of this has kind of been leading up to this moment where he's going to deliver just a perfect end to this magnum opus. And we're going to get into all of that when we finish out the Ecology of Freedom next week. Now, just quickly, this will not be our final video on the Ecology of Freedom. It will be our final proper chapter video. I will also be releasing 2 more videos. The first one is going to be a look at the Ecology of Freedom in the context of Rojava. Rojava, you may already be familiar, is an area in sort of northern Syria that is trying to adopt a lot of the lessons that Murray Bookchin imparted. A lot of this kind of ideas that he sets out in the Ecology of Freedom, they've tried to implement this in Rojava, especially through the leader who's currently in Turkish prison, that's Abdullah Öcalan. It's really, really interesting, and I think it deserves kind of its own separate video that I think is very important. When we talk about the Ecology of Freedom, it's worth looking at the actual applications and what that might look like. There is also going to be the final video, which is going to be a wrap-up of all of this, everything that you need to know about the Ecology of Freedom, kind of last reflections, kind of bringing all of this full circle. So there will be one more video on that. That will be paywalled, unfortunately, behind the Patreon membership. And if you cannot afford that membership for any reason, drop me a line and I will send you the video directly. I am not interested in gatekeeping, but please do consider subscribing just because it helps a lot. Thank you for watching this video, and I will see you next time.